We're approaching a terrible anniversary, the 1 year anniversary of the Russian invasion. Could you give us a sense, Ambassador, of the devastation Russia has inflicted on the population of Ukraine?
Oh, thank you, Drew. Happy to be here with you on this podcast. The devastation is huge. As of now, as you know, since October, Russians have started targeting our civilian infrastructure, destroying our power generation and power distribution. Around 50% of that energy infrastructure is actually destroyed. We now have many cities which are in blackouts. Also, intermittent supply of electricity is disrupting manufacturing, which is actually paralyzing many of the big industry companies and making it extremely difficult, apart from the fact that we've had 5 million Ukrainians who became refugees in Europe, about another 9 million who are internally displaced, those people who had to leave those cities in the east and in the south, and then had to come out somewhere to central Ukraine and western Ukraine. So we are seeing a huge displacement of people. But look, I mean, we can just go into some numbers in details. I mean, around 1,100 hospitals are destroyed. Then we have, I think, over 600 or 700 schools destroyed. So a lot of the civilian infrastructure is being damaged by Russians. It's done deliberately. It's done for the fact this is just war crimes, and they do it to put pressure on the Ukrainian people so that they would actually, put pressure on the political leadership to actually start negotiating with Russia. But at this stage, there's not much to negotiate with the authoritarian leader, which has chosen to invade a sovereign country, to annex territories, and actually wage its imperialistic war. In terms of the casualties, they are high. I don't have the official statistics. They're not being publicly available, but they are high. I mean, we now estimate that we've been able to kill 135,000. This is only the Russian casualties that we're seeing. Those who were killed, and then for every killed, we estimate there is another 2 wounded. But our casualties on our side are also pretty high. Including civilians. Many of them were killed in Mariupol. We estimate that only in Mariupol, officially over 20,000 people get killed, but I think it's much more because we don't have a hold statistics. Russians have forcefully have moved people out of Mariupol to Russia and other places in eastern Ukraine, but many get killed. We just don't know they get killed. They just buried somewhere, so there's no statistics because it's pretty much Mariupol was razed to the ground, just like Aleppo. The 90% of the city is destroyed, and before the war, it almost had 500,000 people there. Well, maybe after 2014 it was a bit less, but still the estimate was that the city had 400,000 people. So the damage is pretty high, and it's ongoing. It's just yesterday actually there was a big attack on Ukraine, and many ballistic missiles and Iranian drones were fired at different cities and different targets throughout the country.
Yeah, I know with Mariupol, they were bringing in mobile crematoria to burn the bodies of tortured, executed Ukrainian civilians. Knowing what they did in other occupied areas, I mean, it's horrifying to imagine what took place in occupied Mariupol. I met some of the refugees from Mariupol when we went to the Polish border at the start of last year, and you could see the far-off looks on the faces of the children and the women with nothing but the clothes on their back. People were so traumatized. And it's interesting you compare it to Aleppo. I mean, the Russian war machine has been perfecting these kind of attempts to destroy cities for a while now, and the West did not stand up to it then. And unfortunately, the people of Ukraine have had to pay the price. I mean, we've seen the castration, beheading of Ukrainian prisoners of war. We've seen rape used as a weapon of war against Ukrainian women and children. We've seen mass executions. I completely understand when you say, what can we do to negotiate with a dictatorship that, is carrying out these crimes against our own people? Could you speak to us about some of these atrocious war crimes committed by the Russian forces in Ukraine? Things like Bucha, things like Irpin.
Look, the more we investigate, the more crimes we discover. Just like in Izum, when we freed Izum, we were able to discover this places of mass graves, and the bodies were taken out of the ground, and examinations were done. and there were multiple signs of torture and rape and other heinous crimes that Russians have perpetrated. The same in Bucha as well.
Yeah.
And the same, many of those things were repeated in Kherson, in the occupied Kherson, where they had torture chambers where people were interrogated and killed in large numbers. It's actually ongoing in the rest of the country, in the occupied territories. We just don't have access to those places, and we don't know what's happening there. Therefore, it's so important for us to be able to free the land and drive Russians out, to take those people, to free those people from that occupation, because those crimes we know that took place in other cities that we've been able to liberate. The same thing is probably happening throughout the country. So Russians will be accountable for what they've done in Ukraine. As you know, there are several streams which are now being created. A special tribunal on the crimes of aggression. This is pretty much the trial or the tribunal which will be trying the top leadership of Russia. But also they've been filed. Different governments have submitted proceedings to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to examine the genocide in Ukraine. And so there are multiple international legal mechanisms which have been launched and used. Of course, it's going to take a while, but what's important now is to collect the evidence of those atrocities perpetrated by the Russians, to be able to use and document them accordingly, so that they could be used in the trials which will be taking place later on.
Vasyl, I know you're speaking for the government as the Ukrainian government, as the ambassador, but just as a human being, what does it do to you knowing that your own countrymen, are facing things like systematic rape carried out by an invading force, torture chambers in occupied towns? What does it do to you when you just learn about these war crimes, and when you hear the first-hand testimony of your fellow countrymen who are being slaughtered and being tortured in these ways?
Look, this is a very traumatizing experience for every Ukrainian.
Yes.
Because, why this war is so different from the wars in the past, because everything is recorded, everything is on Google Drives, everything is on YouTube. So we can now watch this war live, and we can watch what's happening out there, which will be very difficult to forget. And that definitely is having a major impact on the psyche of the people, on the mental health of the Ukrainians. Those who are in Ukraine, those who are exposed to that, those who fled, and even those who live outside of the country, but who have relatives within the country who wake up every morning to read more about what Russians are doing. Extremely traumatizing, for sure. And a lot will have to be done post-war to help with therapy, to help with the recovery from this post-traumatic disorder syndrome and whatnot. Of course, this is still, lots of will have to happen in the future, but for the time being, it's very destabilizing, even for me personally.
Yes.
Look, I remember when we learned about Bucha in April, and then I talked a lot to the Australian media, and I was just retelling the story of what happened there. But then in early July, I was in Bucha with Prime Minister Albanese. And I was at that, and in Bucha only, this is kind of a rural town, suburban town of Kiev, next to Kiev, and they had 461 people killed in that place, civilians, and Russians killed them because they could. And we were at that church with the prime minister and the priest, and also the head of the regional government, the local government there. They were showing us the grounds. And they said, well, in this church, they just we had to dig out a big hole, and 200 people were buried here. And then later on, when the Russians were expelled from Bucha, all those people were taken out of the ground and then buried at a cemetery. But look, and there were pictures of that. There are stories. There are people who survived. There are actually people who are doing that and moving people around, those dead people around. So once you hear that, you see that. You can smell it. I mean, this is just, you can't forget it. This is horrendous.
Wow, I can't even imagine. And so Prime Minister Albanese actually saw the grounds of where these war crimes took place.
Exactly. Yeah, he was there. He was
Wow.
there. He was in Bucha. Then he was in Irpin, which is just next door. He saw those houses destroyed, and both Bucha and Irpin, these are kind of wealthy suburbs of Kiev, and because you can live there, and it's a very nice place. It's in the forest. Um, uh, I mean, great place, and people had a great life, and they all worked in Kiev. So this is just only, just a quick ride by car, about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, you're in downtown Kiev. And yeah, so we were there, but then we also went on a tour to Hostomel military airport. That was a place where the Russian airborne troops were landing when they stormed Kiev at the end of February. We saw the remnants of the destroyed Maria cargo aircraft, which used to be the largest cargo aircraft in the world. And we just saw whatever was left out of it. And yeah, and so there was for the prime minister, he went out to all those places, could see it for himself. And then later on in the afternoon, he had a bilateral meeting with President Zelensky, and also we had a bilateral meeting between the two delegations. So it was a very special visit,
Wow, yeah.
because the first time it ever happened. So the first time we ever had a prime minister from Australia in Ukraine. And we once had a President Poroshenko who visited Australia, but that's about it. And so it was Zelensky was delighted to host Albanese there.
Oh wow. Well, I'm very glad as an Australian that, my Prime Minister visited Ukraine and saw firsthand the devastation, because it really impresses upon us, the the severity of Russia's crimes and just how important it is that Australia support Ukraine. I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, with the Ukrainian government saying that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children and civilians have been forcibly deported to Russia in an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity, and you also see in all these occupied towns the civilian political leadership, anyone who would be in charge of local administration, anyone who didn't collaborate, they were tortured, they were killed. The bodies were exhumed with hands tied behind their backs. Do you believe Russia's war is genocidal in nature? Do you believe they are trying to destroy not just the Ukrainian government, but nationhood itself for Ukraine and the Ukrainian culture?
Absolutely. If you look and you kind of look at all those crimes which Russians are doing, if you look at their narrative, if you look at what it's all driven by, does have clear signs of a genocidal war. Well, firstly, by exterminating civilians, by forcefully deporting those civilians to Russia, kidnapping kids who get then adopted in Russia, kind of a plan of what they plan to do. Originally they planned to take over Kiev, take over Ukraine, and then actually to impose a major Russification program throughout the country. And look, Russia is just exploding its imperialistic and post-colonial ambitions, trying to get back the land that Russian Empire, Soviet Union used to own. But this is just it's bizarre that in the 21st century, a country is actually waging a war against its neighbor and is invading and annexing territories. I mean, we've seen it during the Second World War, but it's been over since 1945. United Nations were established, and UN Charter was adopted, and the main goal of all that international system that was out there, was to actually prevent a similar territorial wars, which we've seen in the Second World War. But this is now Russia is doing the same thing, and look. And that essay that you probably have read that Putin published just a year before the invasion,
Yes.
claiming that Ukraine does not exist, we're the same people, and it's all fake. What is it? And for those who have studied Ukraine, or who have studied Eastern Europe, they know clearly about the time and where Ukraine is coming from, what this Ukrainian identity is. And of course, we have to look at what Russia is doing from a standpoint of colonialism, because we're just part of colony. And of course, during the colonial times,
Yes,
Russia and the Soviet Union, they were actually eradicating national identity. They were erasing it in different ways by banning the language, banning the publishing of books in the Ukrainian language, by actually killing the intelligentsia, like when the Austro-Hungary and the Russian Empire collapsed following the World War I, we had a period of independence in Ukraine which lasted 4 years. It was called Ukrainian National Republic, which was proclaimed in 1917, and that was a period of Ukrainian statehood. And then the Bolsheviks came, they crushed that republic, annexed Ukraine to the Soviet Union. And later on, Hitler and Stalin started the Second World War. In 1939, when they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act, they decided to divide Poland and take over the Baltic states. And that was the start of the Second World War. And look, in the 30s, Stalin organized a big artificial famine, which took the lives of about 5 million people. And the reason for that was, apart from collectivizing people, forcing them to join the collective farms, that it was also a way to actually subdue any nationalistic spirit, as it was called, within the country, by just killing people, by taking away the food from them. So taking away the wheat that they couldn't plant it for next year, and the major starvation has started. And that was horrible. In the 30s, they also killed all the all the bohemian and kind of all the cultural circles of Kiev, all the artists, musicians, composers. I mean, there was a whole generation of all those, which we now call creative industries, right? I mean, the people in the creative industries, or culture, so to say, which were just killed, sent to gulags, exterminated, because it was seen as a source of Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian nationalism. And we thought in 1991, when we became independent, we've studied our history, we've seen what was happening, and we felt like, wow, that's the time for the revival of Ukraine's identity. And we have been able to achieve quite a lot during those past 30 years. And of course, when Russia invaded us in 2014, that was, another kind of search in the rebirth of a nation. All of a sudden, people saw what Russia is and what the ambition is. And Putin has underestimated Ukrainians for sure, because we have many people in Ukraine who speak Russian, but they are Ukrainian, and this is something which Putin cannot get. That
is a Russian speaker by birth, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And apart from that, he's also Jewish, and he was elected as a president in a landslide victory in 2019, when was 73% of people voting for him. It was huge, and so every time we see those Kremlin propaganda where Ukraine is being called a Nazi fascist junta, it's kind of ridiculous having a Jewish president running the country, and to be called like that. And this is just doesn't add up at all. But believe it or not, once you repeat this Nazi fascist junta 100 times, many people start believing that,
Yeah, I mean, Timothy Snyder had a really good line where he said, to the Nazis, they say that Ukraine is run by the Jews, and then to the left, they say Ukraine is run by the Nazis, and then that it's just this bizarre ideology. I mean, I know that the founder of the Night Wolves, and the Night Wolves are very active in Australia, unfortunately. This Putin backing paramilitary bikie group, and I know that the founder of the Night Wolves bikie gang, when asked what should be the slogan of the Ukraine war, he said the slogan for the Ukraine war should be "Death to faggots." I mean, this is the six slurs that they use against the Ukrainian people, and in this kind of bizarre formulation, it's simultaneously Jewish, homosexual, They say even some of the propaganda. I mean, Kirill, the former KGB asset who now leads the Russian Orthodox Church, he says, we're fighting the Antichrist in Ukraine, and they just project whatever they want onto Ukraine. I want to ask you, why do you think they have this kind of obsession? What do you think, motivates this obsession by the Russian ultranationalists and the fascists, where they must destroy Ukraine, where they must control Ukraine, and if they can't control the Ukraine, they have to destroy it? What motivates this bizarre, crazy obsession and the deranged ideology and the conspiracy theories?
Yeah, look, you need to delve deeper a bit, because you need, to kind of understand more about the evolution of ideology of the Russian imperialism. And Putin and kind of the past 20 years were greatly influenced by these thinkers. One of them is the guy called Ilyin, who was a Russian nationalist, and he's been writing lots of stuff, and I understand Putin is a big fan of him. And then a lot of that was then actually developed, or actually further explored by Dugin, who is talking about this Eurasian kind of union and kind of a special path that this Russian Orthodox world is taken, or the Russian world is taken, and they feel that they are being under attack by the Western civilization. And for Russians, they are not actually invading Ukraine. In the domestic Russian narrative, they are under attack by the West, and they are just defending themselves by preemptively killing Ukrainians and destroying Ukraine. And so it's a totally different and kind of coverage of what's happening, right? But like, why they do it? I think it's just the Russian mentality, the craving for respect, and in the Russian mentality, you are respected when you are being feared, right? And that's what has been driving that, and the kind of many of them reminisces the Soviet times, when everybody was so scared of the Soviet Union, and then they feel like that the Soviet Union collapsed, and they've lost the respect of the other countries. And instead of developing and investing money into the development in Russia, which is still a very poor country. It's a large country, 140 million people, but the GDP of Russia is equal to the GDP of the Netherlands, right?
And almost Australia as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But Australia has 25 million people, and they have 140 million people, and they've got all the natural resources. And if you get out of St. Petersburg and Moscow, it's a very poor country. Most of the people still have their toilets outside. They don't even have running water in their houses. It's such a poor country. And what they do, they put all the money in the military. They want to annex Ukraine. They invaded Georgia, grabbed Crimea. And I have to say that the West is also accountable for what has happened, because the reaction to their invasion of Georgia was very weak in 2008. When Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, the sanctions which were imposed were not strong. And they've kind of inspired and emboldened Putin to actually mount another major attack last year, because he felt like that the West depends on them. The EU and Germany specifically depends on the Russian supply of gas. And they sell many products to Russia. Many European companies have invested into the manufacturing in Russia. So there was that dependence that Putin had made a bet on, that, well, they will not be united to help Ukraine. And of course, the whole assessment was that Russia would take Kyiv in a week, and it's all over, and everybody's surrendering, and they are just taking over the country, right, and depriving it of its sovereignty, and then everybody would have to deal with that, right? So, but then it didn't work out, right, and there was a massive resistance and all of that. But look, this imperialism is out there. The far-right groups, which are dominant in Russia, it's a huge following. They now believe Putin is too weak. They need to crack down on Ukraine much harder, use tactical nuclear weapons, and all of that. So for Putin, if he cannot demonstrate any tangible results in Ukraine, this whole group will then go against him, and that's pretty much a lose-lose situation for him.
Yeah, honestly, it's terrifying, and they like to try and slander the Ukrainians by saying it's a Nazi country and they're fighting only Nazis in Ukraine. But I mean, we know that, for example, one of the co-founders of Wagner has the SS tattoos on his collarbones. And you know, especially it's good you mentioned Dugin. I mean, Dugin is absolutely a fascist. I mean, he has articles saying he wants a radical revolutionary fascism. He's an admirer of Julius Evola, who said that he was a super fascist. That was Julius Evola's words. And these are the people that are kind of influencing the narrative in Russia. And it's a very twisted and scary ideology. And it's very scary to think that these people actually want to be strong, these people actually think Putin's going too weak. I mean, it's scary. I mean, sometimes we in the West say if only Putin would fall, but it's scary if the alternative was much worse. And we know, I mean, Wagner is just this terrifying organization. I mean, I was wondering, what would you say to the potential Russian conscripts directly if you could? Because I know we've seen like the Russian politicians, like I think it was the deputy head of the Duma, Sergei Marino. He was smiling and posing with a sledgehammer that was used by Wagner to torture and execute a Russian deserter. They leave the corpses of the Russian conscripts in the fields. Wagner is sending, you know, these basically prison detachments, ex-convicts convicted of rape and all these terrible crimes, and they're sending them in human wave attacks. They leave the corpses in the mud of Ukraine, no respect, no dignity. They don't even care for their own dead. What would you say to, you know, the potential Russian conscripts directly if you had the chance?
Look, I think the story which happened in Ukraine when this old lady approached a Russian soldier in Ukraine and she gave him the sunflower seeds, and she said that when you die, the seeds are going to grow and there will be a sunflower out there. I think for any Russian conscript who's now joining the army, he must be embracing death in Ukraine, and that's what is awaiting there. But you know, it's just I think that Russian has to think about what kind of future Putin is offering to him, his family, and what kind of legacy that Russia is leaving right now, and how many more generations of Russians will be affected by that. You know, it's so tragic, Drew, that Russia has become a toxic country, and that's the biggest achievement of Putin. Look, nobody wants to deal with Russia. Russia is becoming a pariah state. It's pretty much like in North Korea. Almost there, is getting ostracized from different international forums. You know, their athletes cannot perform in many different competitions, and they're being just despised. Everybody hates them. I mean, what kind of a situation that is? I mean, in all civilized democratic world, wherever Russians are going, they're being hated just because of who they are, but what they've done in Ukraine. And it's not only about, you know, it's natural. It just once people read about what happened in Bucha, Izum, about all these atrocities, that was not Vladimir Putin who did it. Those were Russian soldiers who did it. And they did it at will. They did it because they could, and they were inspired to do that. And this is so heinous. And then when people read about it, how can they not be hated? And because the accountability in this particular case is on the entire Russian nation. They support Putin. This war is supported in Russia, and believe it or not, and that's very unfortunate.
This is the tragedy, because at the start of the war, a lot of people in the West wanted to believe that it was just Putin, and you know, Russia is not Putin. But as you say, the atrocities in Bucha, the atrocities carried out all across Ukraine, these were carried out by, you know, in many cases, ordinary Russian soldiers. And so, I mean, just the poison that Putin and the ultranationalists and the fascists in Russia have, you know, have the way they poison their own country and its image internationally. I mean, it is a terrible tragedy. And I don't know. I mean, what future do you think there is for Russia? I mean, there's actually no kind of opposition to Putin within Russia from the kind of liberals or the you know, anti-war people. In fact, potentially the biggest opposition to Putin is actually coming from the fascists, who are saying, you know, we have to go harder. I mean, God, what can you even do then? I mean, it is unfortunately, it is such a poisoned country. And I mean, what can change unless, you know, Russia is defeated? I mean, it's What would you say to the Russian people? I mean, to the people who have fallen for this fascist ideology, for the people who've, fallen for the propaganda that the Ukrainians are all Nazis and the West is the real one fighting. I mean, what do you say to them?
Look, you see, I've met many Russians throughout my life. I didn't spend much time in Russia. I think I've only been 3 or 4 times in Moscow, and just only for a day. I never actually stayed there any longer. And the last time I think I was there, 2012. That was when I was there. But when I studied in London, I studied in Sweden, and in other places. I've been meeting many Russians right throughout my life.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, all those Russians, who I met, they all speak English. They all traveled the world, been educated abroad, and all those who live in Russia, they never kind of, since the start of the war, not a single one has reached out to me.
Yeah.
The only Russians who reached out to me who actually live outside of Russia. And that for me was kind of like a big surprise because, well, firstly, the internet in Russia is not that heavily controlled as it is in China, for instance.
Yeah.
So they still, and those people I know, they definitely speak English. They do have access to other sources, but nobody had, nobody really done anything. I mean, they probably support it because I'm not asking for public statements at this stage.
Yeah.
So could be just a purely human kind of interaction saying, oh, well, sorry, we feel guilty, but it's not us, right? Russia is different. There are people who don't support it, and we don't support Putin, but nobody reached out,
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, interesting. Why is that? Was I asking too much? And you see, when 2 million people come to the streets of Moscow, Putin can do nothing with them. And because, he can crack down on a group of 10 or 20,000 people, but if there's 1 million, there's not much he can do.
Yeah.
And we all, were hoping that Russians can go out there and protest and actually do it, but they don't. And the reason is very simple, because there's just not enough people there to do it, which because many of them actually support the war. Well, of course, there are those who are scared, who are afraid to lose a job or to be, beaten up, or who are afraid. But look, when there is 1 million people in Moscow, there's not much Putin can do. They don't have the resources to crack down on 1 million people.
Of course.
And this is what should have happened. And maybe there is a chance it will happen one day. I don't know. I mean, it's just a hope. My question is, what if we wake up tomorrow and Putin is gone? I think it will be just, this whole house of cards is going to collapse. It's not going to stand. All these different groups of, like Wagner Group and Kadyrov Group and all these intelligence agencies and the military, there's lots of competition among those groups. Yeah, they hate each other, and everybody believes that that he's a successor to Putin, right? So when this guy is gone, right, got a heart attack or something, too much stress, what's going to happen, right? Yeah. And but I think at the end of the day, it will be a good thing for Ukraine when he's gone. That's for sure. Because look, how worse can it get any worse? It probably can't. So it's already so bad. But look, I speak Russian. I know Russian, though I'm a Ukrainian speaker in my daily life, and I always use Ukrainian. But when I was a kid, I was reading all the books in Russian, and you know why, Drew? Because there are no books in Ukrainian. There are no fun books in Ukrainian. The only fun books for kids in those days, the translations of the American or British writers, they were all in Russian. Wow. And so it was kind of bizarre. I went to Ukrainian school, and I didn't see much of the Soviet Union, to be frank. I was born in 1981, so I didn't really see that much of the Soviet Union anyways. But still, in the 90s, we still kind of, I was living through the legacy of the Soviet Union, and we've seen it all. And in a way, that's I understand Russia really well.
Yeah,
and I understand Russian people and their literature and their writing and what they're thinking, and it's really very deeply out there. It's kind of embedded into their psyche, and that kind of as we call it, you were talking about the opposition in Russia. We have a joke in Ukraine that Russian liberalism ends on the question of Ukraine. Any Russian liberal, you ask that person about Crimea, and you're gonna hear what you're gonna hear, right? Yeah. For instance, right? Yeah, and that happened with Alexei Navalny, by the way. I mean,
I know.
He supported the annexation of Crimea.
I know.
I mean, this is just one of the examples. But look, That's been, but there are many others like that. So they're anti-Putin, they're anti-corruption, they're everything. They hate the leadership of Russia. But then you ask them about Ukraine, and you get a totally different answer.
Oh, of course. And the sad and ironic thing is, we actually don't want the liberal anti-corruption people to get in charge of the war, because what they want to prosecute the war better without the corruption. We want the Russian armed forces to be corrupt. We want their
exactly.
we want their vehicles to bog down because they haven't repaired the tires, etc. And yeah, God, it's so depressing that even Alexei Navalny, I think he says that he's against the war now, but I mean, yeah, he backed the war in Crimea, and I know there's obviously that past history where he referred to migrants from Central Asia as cockroaches and stuff, which is extremely depressing. I mean, if this is the Russian liberal opposition.
Exactly. Look, on a human level, I feel sorry for him. I hope
Yeah,
he
me
doesn't
too.
die in that jail. I hope he's out of that. But
Me too.
maybe that's also kind of after this war, after he's seen what has happened, maybe he can revisit his ideas. Maybe he feels sorry for what he said. But it's just, look, I admit that people can change, and their thinking can change, and they just have to admit to their mistakes and move on. It's all right.
Exactly. Yeah, I hope the exact same for Navalny. I was wondering, Ambassador, if you could address Putin directly, what would you say right now?
Look, you're asking too many of those questions, Drew. I mean, it's difficult for me, even to imagine, seeing Vladimir Putin, and what would I say, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know how to answer that. I'll have to think about it. I mean, it's just,
fair enough.
it's just, it's just, what would you say to Putin, right? I mean, Drew, what would you say to Putin? I mean,
well, I don't know. There's nothing you can say. I mean, you have those Western politicians like Macron who were trying to shuttle back and forth saying, I've talked to Putin. I think I can stop the war. And I mean, he didn't care. I mean, Putin is lost in his own reality. There's nothing a Western politician, there's nothing anyone can say to Putin.
Look, for Putin, all this, he's seen many French presidents so far, right?
Yeah.
Since the year 2000. I mean, for Putin, all these people, they just change, right? He thinks they are so weak because they have this democracy. Look, Prime Minister of Britain stepped down because of a party during COVID, right?
Yeah.
And Putin is sitting out, laughing out loud, right?
Yeah.
He's the richest man in the world. I mean, he controls the country. He can, annex countries. And there's this dude who had to step down because of a party. It's just hilarious for him,
Yeah.
He just mocks all the democratic leaders, right? Because he finds them weak. And he's seen many presidents, right? Many American presidents, French presidents. Well, Angela Merkel lasts long, but still, she's gone, and now there's new guys. So for Putin, I mean, that's his war against democracy, pretty much. A new pathway of authoritarian leadership and development, which could be also achieved through that. Well, not anymore, to be frank, because I mean, how many resources they have diverted towards the war against Ukraine. I mean, and the prospect of any further economic development and all the sanctions imposed now on Russia is long term. So I think it's just deprived people of a more decent life in Russia, and I hope they will pay him back.
Yeah, I agree. I was wondering, Ambassador, when Ukrainians see, for example, Xi Jinping sign up to a pact of limitless friendship with Putin, and they see that Chinese state propaganda sometimes echoes the Russian propaganda narrative, they see China refuse to condemn the war crimes. How do Ukrainians feel when they see that? And how do they feel when they see countries like, big countries like India, great democracy, one of the world's largest democracy, but they have tried to stay to an extent neutral? I mean, how do Ukrainians feel when they see that?
Look, there is not much coverage of that in Ukraine, to be frank. Of course, in my circles, people discuss it kind of a more kind of geopolitical level. But generally, kind of on a general public discourse, you don't see much of it.
Of course,
we can hardly cope with the Russian invasion and the daily news of what Russians are doing. So there is not much of a kind of thinking about China or India. It's only in my kind of circles where people discuss it, but they kind of delve deeper, right? Because if you look at China-Ukraine relations, China was #1 trading partner for Ukraine before the war, right?
True, yeah.
Just like for many other countries of the world, right? For instance, for New Zealand, and also
even Australia.
Yeah, and for you, I mean, it's still the largest, market for your iron ore. It's still right. And for us, so now the biggest trading partner is the EU as a economic bloc. But if you look individually, country by country, it's China, right?
Yeah.
And we trade a lot. And for instance, in 2021, the bilateral trade between China and Ukraine was $20 billion US, right?
Yeah.
So they buy primarily corn, barley, sunflower oil from Ukraine. At a certain stage, it accounted for almost 20% of all China's total imports of grains, for instance.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And we've been buying lots of their fertilizers. And we also sell a lot of iron ore to them as well. Because we're also a big producer of iron ore, just as you are, right? So look, they've invested in some of the infrastructure in Ukraine. So generally, in terms of speaking of trade, the trade was out there. It was for the benefit, bilateral trade, international trade is for from a liberal standpoint of view, it's a good thing, right? It brings prosperity to both countries trading, correct? On a political side, we feel like China is not really, geopolitically benefited from this war. They've been able to reassert themselves in Central Asia. Russia is now depending on China. China is benefiting from the discounted price on oil and gas and other raw materials and fossil fuels they're buying from Russia. But I'm not sure if it's really in the long term, if that is of benefit of China and Chinese people. Because you see, China has demonstrated phenomenal growth during the past 20 years. And I'm just only talking about economic growth, right? And they've been able to, since they joined WTO in 2001, they've been able to lock in their liberal reforms, economic reforms within the country, which became a major driver of foreign direct investment into the country. And that spurred a huge economic development within the country. They've been able to take out millions and millions of people out of poverty. Now, looking at what's happening now they have to pay, a higher price for commodities, and they're the biggest importer of commodities globally. Can they actually sustain the growth for the country to make sure that people get to live better, right? The relationship between China and the US is huge. They are the major trading partners. They depend on each other. China is the biggest investor in the American debt, all this American treasury bonds. And US is the biggest market for China, right? The Chinese dependence on the West is much higher than the Russian dependence on the West, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So it's a little bit more complicated, right? Of course, I mean, we're not looking at the human rights issues and other issues. I mean, this is a different topic. I'm just, from a standpoint of the economic interest, right? For India depends on the supply of Russian weapons, right? If they can diversify the supply of weapons to India, they will not depend on Russia that much. I think India said it pretty clear, guys. Russia is sending us tanks, which we need to maintain, and we need to have our own capabilities. If you can sell us your weapons, we are ready to consider. China has so many people; they need access to energy, and they buy discounted oil from Russia. They benefit from it. So a lot of these countries, which were the so-called non-aligned countries, like in the Soviet times and the Cold War times, all these countries were non-aligned, like India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and many others were like part of this non-alignment movement, which kind of maintained good relations both with the Soviet Union and the West, right? So now they are also saying, oh, well, look, I mean, we have big populations out there, and we have national interests, and we need to feed those people. But at the end of the day, it's pretty clear that a lot of those countries are suffering because of the large populations they have. And Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of food in the world. We produce 10% of the global output of grain, 50% of the sunflower oil, and 17% of barley. And we've been the major supplier of these products to many countries in Africa, Middle East, even Indonesia it was a huge market for Ukraine, the same China. And now the prices have skyrocketed. Is it in the interest of those countries that this war goes on and this instability, volatility, uncertainty? We've been able to have this grain corridor to help us export some of the grain products. Now it expires in March. Russia is creating some artificial impediments for the inspection of those vessels, and it's actually causing another wave of food shortages in many other countries which depended it. So they do it artificially, right? And then they spread a narrative in Africa that the lack of food here is a result of the Western powers who want to starve you, which is ridiculous. The only reason they are starving is because Russia is waging a war in Ukraine and things like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very. I mean, it's just another way that the war that is being waged by Putin is genocidal. I mean, the fact that they're willing to see potentially tens of millions of people, if not hundreds of millions of people in developing countries starve by weaponizing grain exports from Ukraine and trying to cut off that access. I mean, it's causing so many billions of people across the world to suffer due to the skyrocketing prices, etc.
People in Africa were starving actually because they didn't have bread.
Yeah. As we come into the spring, Vasyl, could you explain to us how the military situation is? Is there the probability of a renewed Russian offensive on Kiev? We know that they're pushing very, very hard in Bakhmut and in the eastern Ukraine right now, and the Ukrainian army needs ammunition because the rate of ammunition expenditure just per day, they're expending the amount of ammunition that would be produced by a small European army in just peacetime. Tremendous amounts of ammunition are being expended. Could you explain to us the military situation right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we see a big buildup of the Russian troops in the east, and they're getting ready for the major offensive as we get closer to the spring. Currently, when it's very muddy, it's kind of difficult to move the troops, but once it's going to dry up, we are expecting a major offensive out there, trying to kind of pretty much consolidate their control. If Donetsk Oblast and whatever is remaining in the Luhansk Oblast. So it will be happening. Will they mount another attack on Kyiv? There are different assessments of the situations. I wouldn't rule it out, especially, and the reason they're now trying to probably they will hasten with this another offensive on Ukraine is just because, as you know, we've now been able to rally this tank coalition, and before these tanks arrive, I think Russians want to give it another go, right? And maybe even from Belarus again. It's of course logistical routes are not very convenient because this is all in the north of Ukraine. It's all muddy. It's all the swamps of which are there on the border. So you can't really move troops that easily, and we've seen that 60-kilometer column of military kit in the past when Russians get stuck. But they may still do it. They may actually attack Ukraine from Volyn Oblast on the border with Poland and Belarus from that side, trying to cut off us from the supplies of all the supplies which are coming to Ukraine, military supplies. We don't rule it out. I think different scenarios are out there. And for this, we need to make sure that Ukraine has weapons to defend itself and to repel Russians.
Yes, of course. I really agree with Misha Zelinsky, who wrote in the Australian Financial Review, when the West is arming and when Australia is arming Ukraine, it's not charity, it's self-defense. We don't want to be in a world where small countries can be invaded by empires that will. Such a world would be a disaster for a country like Australia with a population of only 25 million. So
absolutely.
So I'm just asking. I mean, what is the most desperate need for Ukraine right now in terms of Western military supplies, Western military kit? Is there anything Australia can supply right now that could greatly increase, the abilities of the Ukrainian armed forces in the field?
Well, generally the needs of Ukraine currently they all come down to the tanks and equipment. And that's one thing. Another thing is, of course, long-range missiles and missiles for multiple rocket launchers. We have missiles for air defense systems and 155 millimeter rounds. As you have mentioned exactly that, on a heavy day, on a kind of an intensive day of fighting, Ukraine spends about 5,000 rounds of that ammunition, right? And there is a very limited stockpiles of that throughout the world, right? So, and the production cannot maintain, the production capacity is limited, right? Or it's now being kind of restarted in many countries which used to have it and then phased it out. And by the way, the same for Australia. I mean, they're now thinking of actually, relaunching the production of 155 millimeter ammunition out here. But look, Australian Bushmasters have been performing really well. Australia committed 90. We've seen them in action. We've seen them liberating parts of Kharkiv region, and how well they really performed there. Sending more Bushmasters is always a good idea. And that would help Ukraine a lot. What's important, Drew, is that Australia is in sync with the NATO allies, and in terms of continually supporting Ukraine. And I think that's a big investment into maintaining a rules-based international order. It's important that Ukraine wins, because if we don't, it will embolden many other authoritarian leaders, or those nations which have the strength to change borders by force. And this is something that Australia cannot afford.
Yes, of course, of course. I was thinking maybe just as the last question, Vasyl, and maybe you might be limited in how you can answer, but I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about some of the propagandists who are trying to push the Russian line in Australia. So you've got people like the Night Wolves. And really, I mean, they try to appear tough, but in Australia, they're a bunch of old men. I saw them when I was protesting outside the Russian consulate in Sydney. I saw the Night Wolves, and the best they had to offer. And really, they're like old men with big pot bellies. You've got people like Simeon Boykov. I mean, Simeon's probably not. He'd probably be a bit of a tough bloke in rugby or something like that. He's a big unit, but I don't think he's necessarily going to be completing any beep tests, etc. I'm not sure how good he would be in cardio, etc. So you've got a bunch of a pack of bumbling fools, really. I mean, Simeon has somehow holed himself up in the Russian consulate in Sydney. I think he's trying to escape assault charges because he pushed an elderly Ukrainian Australian man down the stairs, and then he's now holed himself up in the Russian consulate in Sydney to escape charges. I think he's actually potentially, renounced his Australian citizenship. I mean, they are a pack of fools, but with Boykov, I mean, this is someone who potentially fought in the Donbass with Russian separatists. I mean, he was kind of boasting to the ABC, "You'll never be able to prove it." The photos of him holding assault rifles, photos of him with separatists. He met with Gherkin, the man found responsible for the shoot down of MH17. 38 Australians were killed. I mean, 38 Australians were killed. And Simeon Boykov likes to call himself the Aussie Cossack, and he's meeting with someone who murdered Australian citizens. And you've got people in Boykov's Telegram channel who've expressed support for the ambush, the execution of those 2 young Australian police officers in December. I mean, it is very concerning. I mean, he's a bumbling fool, and so are the sort of Night Wolves in Australia. And you get a couple of those kind of old ex-Australian diplomats, the Tony Kevins of the world, who are kind of very much the pro-Putin line. But I mean, maybe we're fortunate in Australia that the Russian propaganda effort is so weak and we're dealing with such fools. But I mean, I know that Boykov's tried to organize people to harass you personally. I mean, what's the situation there with a lot of these Russian propagandists in Australia?
Look, I would be very curious to see an investigation done by one of the journalists here in Australia to kind of delve deeper into the situation. It's all part of this malign foreign influence. And there are so many different ways of how it could be organized. And for instance, people like Boykov and Night Wolves, they could be also used for different special kind of situations, right? Okay, let's harass the Ukrainian ambassador, distract him from his work, right?
Yeah.
And you can mount an attack, and also the way Russians operate, they like far left, they like far right, so they're always out there. If you look at far right, far left in any country, and even Australia, you'll see Russians there, one way or another.
Red-Brown Alliance,
yeah. So they just kind of love it. There are different narratives on both sides, but this is where they are. Also, they allow this, anti-establishment, right? Everybody who hates the government, who doesn't trust the government, therefore they're so much aligned with all these anti-vaxxers, right?
Yes.
And a lot of them were kind of grassroots, but then all of a sudden it's a good and it's a very favorable environment out there, because the idea is, if people don't trust the government, if they don't trust mainstream media, they would trust anything, right? And this is where all this conspiracy theories kick in, and this is when people get really kind of believing into that, right? Then there are some, there are actually since some ex-military people who've been, writing this longer pieces about what the origin of this war, right? And
and it's ex-Ukraine also, I think.
Yeah. Oh, this is it needs to be kind of, I'm very interested to hear where it's coming. And the guy is writing some sort of PhD somewhere. I'm like, oh, wow, that's interesting for an ex-military. To be kind of, there was one guy who showed up to an event here at the ANU the other day. He also said he's a military strategist, and he repeated it twice, that his thinking was like a thinking from the Kremlin. And I'm like, so, because when people claim they're military strategists, they kind of also, claim that they have some sort of credibility in what they say, as if they want people to believe that they know something more than all the rest. But it's just it doesn't work like that. It does mean that you call yourself a military strategist, that you actually know anything about Ukraine and Russia,
of course,
or but then a lot of people don't understand it, right? And actually they kind of gaining this credibility, right? And look, so it's taken place here. I think it's important for the Home Office to monitor the situation and to see what's happening, what's the link, So all of a sudden, Simon Boyko, where did he hide? He went to the Russian
consulate in Sydney.
Yeah, and he doesn't have a Russian citizenship, by the way. He has only Australian citizenship, and there are some charges against him. So he, instead of going and facing the court, he decided to hide there. And what's the plan? We've seen Julian Assange in the embassy for what, 5-6 years. Well, that's his plan. What's he's gonna do, right?
God,
it's but he has a big following. He's pretty skillful at what he does.
He's smart the way they've used him.
His harassment campaign against me, it was a nuisance. I didn't enjoy it. But look, I mean, I expected him to do it much sooner. If he waited, so long to do it. Well, I knew it was coming anyways, right? It was just a matter of time when it was going to happen. But that's the reality of where we live in. My friends are in the trenches getting killed by the Russians. So this is what's happening on a daily basis. And
maybe if Simeon wants to demonstrate his patriotism, he can go to the front line and join one of the Wagner penal brigades who are doing the human wave attacks. But I know with Simeon, I mean, this guy's a coward. He's holed up in the Russian consulate. And it's very interesting because when he launched that harassment campaign against you, I believe he was in the Russian consulate at that time. So the Russian consulate are giving haven to him, and they're giving him, protection while he's launching harassment campaigns against the Ukrainian ambassador. And you have to wonder whether that's actually coordinated. And if so, that is an attack on Ukrainian diplomats in Australia.
Well, exactly. If he's hiding there and he's mounting a campaign, what are the chances that it's all coordinated with the Russian intelligence? And you've seen that building, right, of the Russian consulate in Sydney. It's huge. I mean, and so look at the number of people working there, and I mean, why wouldn't it be coordinated? I mean, it makes sense, right? And but look, it's up to Australian government and to the Australian judiciary and law enforcement to decide how they deal with that. But there is a fact. I mean, and it's all in a public domain, and therefore, look, I mean, it's out there.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be interesting to see whether he wants to spend 10 years holed up in the Russian consulate to escape the charges for pushing a Ukrainian Australian down the stairs. I mean, he went to the Ukrainian ambassador. He went to the Ukrainian rally with the express intention to try start a fight, to try harass Ukrainians. And he got his wish. He pushed someone down the stairs. And you're right. He's a skillful propagandist in a way, because it was smart of him to latch onto the anti-vax movement and pretend he's an Aussie patriot. Meanwhile, there's quotes of him saying, Australia's an enemy country and I'm here to push Russian propaganda. There's direct quotes by him. So, this guy, I would say, is not loyal to Australia in any way. If he's meeting with Russian separatist leaders in the Donbass who actually killed 38 Australian citizens shooting down MH17, and he's meeting with the person who was indicted by the Netherlands courts for the shoot down that killed 38 Australian citizens. I mean, this guy is not an Australian patriot by any means. This guy's actually celebrating the murder of his supposedly fellow citizens, this so-called patriot of Australia.
Exactly. But look, it's enough about him. It's enough airtime for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure he'll enjoy this, but look, we just hope the courts do their job. Thank you, Vasyl. This has been a really interesting conversation. Hopefully we'll keep in touch. Anything we can do to try support the brave Ukrainian forces who are fighting. If there are any charities, if there's anywhere that ordinary Australians can donate to, please, maybe there's kind of a link you can share here where Australians who want to support the Ukrainians can donate. Please let us know.
Absolutely. I would encourage you to donate to United 24, and it's an online platform which has been launched by the president of Ukraine. It could be directed towards certain causes, but the donations can be made throughout, from all over the world. And if you have $1 or $2 and you want to donate, that's the best way to do it.
Thank you so much. United 24, we'll put the link in the description. Thank you so much for the really interesting conversation, Ambassador. Thank you so much for what you've done to support the Ukrainian people. And thank you so much to everyone who's bravely fighting in Ukraine, because I think this is a struggle for freedom everywhere. It's not just a struggle for the future of Ukraine. It's a struggle for the future of democracy, freedom. It's a struggle against colonialism, imperialism. We want to see a century free of imperialism and colonialism. So the Ukrainian people are doing such a great service to mankind right now. And it's so sad that the Ukrainian people have to suffer like this, but really the Ukrainians are doing something that, history will remember, that the Ukrainians stood against tyranny. And I have every faith the Ukrainians will win the war, and Australia just has to keep supporting as much as we can. Send more Bushmasters.
Thank you very much, Drew.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador.